5 paths the Packers could take in the first round and where it would lead them. That's next on Locked On Packers.
You are Locked On Packers, your daily Green Bay Packers podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
You are Locked On Packers, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm Peter Bukowski, and I cover the Packers for The Leap, a newsletter I would love for you to subscribe to. Follow me on Twitter, Peter_Bukowski. Follow the podcast on Twitter, Locked On Packers. Like us on Facebook. Subscribe to the podcast to iTunes, Spotify, Google Podcasts, wherever you find podcasts, you will find Locked On Packers, the #1 Packers podcast on the internet, and the show for fans who know what happened, they want to know why and how. Today's episode brought to you by our friends at the 2025 Nissan Armada. Stay tuned for the Armada Player of the Week. That's later in the show. I want to go through scenarios today. We did this a couple weeks ago, and I think it's worth doing again now that we have a better feel for the if-then scenarios. We think, anyway, we have an idea of where the Packers are looking, where they're focusing resources, where this draft is ultimately shaking out. And I think it's important, actually, that we start at the end. And by that, I mean the third round. This is a critical thing to dig into a little bit because I think the Packers are going to take a receiver with one of their first 2 picks. I think they're going to take a pass rusher with one of their first 2 picks in a perfect world for them. So, what does that mean with their third round pick? The more that I look at this, and I have the 2025 consensus board from The Athletic. So they're taking, this is what the media consensus is around these players. And I see an awful lot of offensive linemen in that third round range. Now, I think the Packers need to find an interior offensive lineman. And they need to do that in a way that makes sense for them. Now, when they drafted Sean Ryan, they used a 3rd round pick on him. When they drafted Josh Myers, they used a 2nd round pick on him. I don't expect them to do that in a draft where you feel like you need to get premium position players. So the Packers have the 87th overall selection. In that range, Tate Ratledge, interior offensive lineman from Georgia. Jared Wilson, interior offensive lineman from Georgia. Wyatt Millam, a tackle convert to play guard or center from West Virginia. Cameron Williams, who's a tackle, probably stays a tackle, but could be a guard from Texas. Charles Grant, who is purely a tackle, but maybe he's light, you convert him to center. Anthony Belton from North Carolina State. A little bit further down, but they had him in for a visit. Emory Jones, offensive tackle from LSU. They had him in for a visit. That's a lot of offensive linemen that I named from 79th on the consensus board to 96th on the consensus board. That's a nice big band. And what did I named 6 guys. That's a nice group. I think that the 3rd round pick is where I think Green Bay could surprise some folks with, an idea kind of off the board, whether it's a safety, whether it's a linebacker. We'll get into that when we go through some of these scenarios. But the more that I look at this, the more that I think this ends up with an offensive lineman in round 3, but an interior offensive lineman. Now, whether that is someone who played on the interior or is a tackle convert, they're going to have some options there. Tate Ratledge, he played on the interior. The Packers don't tend to take guys, except for centers. They don't tend to take interior players who played on the interior. Tate Ratledge played guard. Now, he tested like an elite athlete at that position. But would they take someone who played guard to play guard? I know that seems like a weird thing to say, but that is a thing for the Packers. Now, on the other hand, you've got someone like Jared Wilson, who, by the way, 21 years old, will be 22 in June. We're talking about someone who played center. All teams, or second team All SEC, was the starting center last year. Center. Played center. That would tell us something about Elton Jenkins. We've talked about some of that stuff. So I wanted to get that part of this out of the way before we go into some of the scenarios. And let's start with what I think is the scenario that if the Packers had to pick, they would pick. And that is they find an edge rusher in the first round. That is the cleanest situation for them. Because you get a Donovan Ezeraku, 26th right now on the consensus board. They get a Mykel Williams, right now 15th on the consensus board. I'd be surprised if he fell. Shamar Stewart is 16th on the consensus board. I would not be surprised if he's there at 23. James Pierce at 20. I would be a little surprised if he's the pick. And based on the kinds of players that they are showing the most interest in, it seems clear to me that they would prefer to take a true pass rushing edge in the first round when it comes to drafting pass rushers. We'll get to the defensive tackle of it all coming up. So if they get one of those guys, then I think Donovan Ezeraku as likely as any, and I think he's most likely to be there. So let's go with him here. Okay, 26th overall player, but the Packers have extra intel, Boston College. This is where the Packers make their money. Second round receivers. Jaden Higgins, the 47th overall player. I wouldn't be surprised if he went sooner. The backup plan to me is Jack Besh. He's creeping up the board. 55 overall. Do not be surprised if the Packers use the 54th overall pick on Jack Besh. That is, as of this moment, exactly where the consensus has him. Trey Harris at 61 also fits. So when you just look at trying to project, okay, what makes the most sense and where are the sweet spots in the draft for those players, early 20s is right where all these pass rushers are going to be, if not coming off the board, close to off the board. And then right in the late 40s, early 50s, that's where you're going to see Jaden Higgins, Jack Besh, and Trey Harris all come off the board. And maybe Jalen Royals, he's at 69 here. Jalen Noel, 66. The thing is, you cannot wait until 87. Once you get to 87, there's just nothing here. So that's what the Packers are looking at here. So then where do they go after that? This is the offensive line conversation. I think Jared Wilson is maybe not the ideal. I like the idea of someone like Wyatt Millam because you're getting that positional versatility. Didn't test, on the outstanding end for a tackle, but for a guard, right in the range where you like, but played tackle at West Virginia. 7.85 relative athletic score as a tackle, 6'6", 313. That's for the Packers. That's definitely a guard. And I think that he would make a lot of sense. Charles Grant, maybe more like a center. But the Millam, the versatility, he's 88th on the consensus board. That makes a ton of sense. For the Packers, you got a 2026 need at guard. If you can't work out an extension that makes sense for Sean Ryan on the low end, I think he can make plenty of money. I would expect he's not a Packer in all likelihood unless you're moving on from Elton Jenkins, in which case you need a center. Jared Wilson, the higher player on the board, but he's a center probably only. Fits the prototypes that the Packers would want. One of those two guys in the third round. That's your sort of nice middle road outcome. Edge, receiver, tackle, guard. Now, if that's not the way this breaks, then it starts to get interesting. We'll talk about that next on Locked On Packers. The Armada Player of the Week brought to you by our friends at Nissan and the all-new 2025 Nissan Armada. Each week, we're taking a look at our draft prospects and pick one guy that stands apart. The guy we believe showcased the strength and power needed to push the Packers forward as we look toward the next season. This week's Armada and clear-cut Player of the Week. We're coming all the way back because it seems like the momentum has returned on Packers Twitter. Thank you all. I like to think that I started the momentum here about 6-8 weeks ago. Jaden Higgins. Jaden Higgins is heavy duty. 6'4", 215, rugged, conquers the road with capability and confidence. Dream big, go big, a receiver early. What a world. When it comes to the Nissan Armada, they say go forth and conquer, and that's exactly what I think Jaden Higgins can be for the Green Bay Packers. It's clear that he is out here and ready to conquer the road ahead with confidence, just like you can in the all-new Nissan Armada or any of their outstanding vehicles. Take the Nissan Armada, Rogue, or Pathfinder and go find your next big adventure. Shop NissanUSA.com. To me, the next most likely scenario, and the scenario that I think the Packers are most interested in, is taking a receiver in the first round. As I have said, I don't think that happens at 23. Mark Murphy confirmed in an interview yesterday, he told Brian Gutekunst, if the best thing for the Green Bay Packers is to trade out of the first round, you have every permission to trade out of the first round. We went through 2 trades with the Browns and the Giants. Todd McShay in his mock. Now, those came out the same day. It was beautiful the way this worked. I had my show where we talked explicitly about a trade out, and Todd McShay in his mock said, start thinking about this stuff. And he had the Browns trading into, I believe, like the high teens. I think teams are going to be aggressive because I don't think the cost of trading up is going to be huge. I think teams are going to be willing to trade down. The Packers could find a willing partner here. You can move back to 33, 34. Now, Emeka Egbuka is not in that range. He's certainly higher. But I think Luther Burden is 23. Emeka Egbuka is 24. Jaden Higgins, I mentioned, 47. So if you're sitting there with all 3 of those guys on the board and all of the edge players, Jalen Walker, Mike Green, Michael Williams, Shamar Stewart, James Pierce Jr., Davin Ezraku, they could all be gone by 23. And you like what you've got day 2 interior pass rush wise on the board. We talked about that yesterday. And now you're sitting there with all of these receivers on the board. Okay, you trade down and you add one of those picks in the 60s. Now you're looking at what is available to you at, let's say, pick 33. You're probably not going to have all of those receivers, but one of them is going to be there. And I continue to believe that the cleanest fit for the Green Bay Packers is Jaden Higgins for a couple of different reasons. Number one, he can be your true X mismatch player. They do not have. So even if you grab a Luther Burden or Emeka Egbuka, they do not have a guy who just by being him is a mismatch. And I don't mean because he's so good at getting open and running routes and all that stuff. When was the last time they had a guy who you just said one-on-one, I expect this guy to win because of who he is? It's Davante Adams, who is a special case. There are very few guys who are at his size, Davante Adams. Like, he's not Mike Evans at 6'5", who can just go up and win the ball for you. T. Higgins, those guys. He could do that because he had elite leaping ability and ball tracking and was a sui generis kind of player. That's not going to be ever someone like Emeka Egbuka or Luther Burden. Jaden Higgins can be that guy. Backside, isolated, one-on-one, on a slant, on 3rd and 6. He can just body up a corner and get you a first down, but he can also work vertically. And one of the problems of having Jayden Reed in the slot, it's probably the only problem, frankly, of having Jayden Reed in the slot, is as a blocker, he's just not big. He's a willing blocker. He gives good effort. He's just not very big. So you can't have him go do the things that Cooper Kupp can do and go dig out linebackers and safeties. defensive ends come down and crash. He can't really do that. Jaden Higgins does. And so to me, he is the cleanest fit here. At the top of the second round, some people are going to say a reach. I think he's a first round player all day, not a reach to me. So, but now you've added a second round pick. So you didn't get that edge in the first round. You got your receiver. This is where I'm taking TJ Sanders. 52 on the big board and everything that they want to be in terms of size, explosiveness, pass rush ability. I really, really like his tape. He fits what they're looking for. He is if you need him to be a Devontae Wyatt replacement, he can be your 3 technique of the future, can play next to Kenny Clark, is never going to do the things that Kenny Clark can do, but can rush the passer. And then if you're adding one of these picks in the 60s, now, who knows? Maybe you take a flyer on a Princely Umamielen, who's 64 on the consensus board. A Marcus Mbo from Purdue, who I don't love in this spot. I would take him around later, but I would understand the Packers if they did that. Maybe you take a flyer because you pick up an extra pick. It's a luxury pick. You take someone like Josiah Stewart here, who's undersized, the pass rusher from Michigan. All of the underlying metrics say this guy kicks ass. I agree, but he's a 6-foot-tall pass rusher. I would take Ozzie Trapilo from Boston College. Jonas Sevenaya from Arizona. If you pick up that pick in the 60s, I would be looking at that group of offensive linemen right there. So I get my receiver. Then I can grab a pass rusher. Now I have that offensive line depth. And in the 80s, now I've got freedom. There's some safeties here. I can add safety depth. Kevin Winston Jr. from Penn State. Billy Bowman Jr. from Oklahoma. If I want to get a little frisky, Terrence Ferguson from Oregon, the tight end. Why not? How about you want to add a power back in here? Cam Scadaboo. Olufemi Oladejo, if he's there at 87. This is where you're going to make your money. If you can trade down, like this is, I think it's the plan B, but in some ways, I believe it maybe should be plan A, because you add another pick on day 2, you can do everything you need. You can do everything you need. So what if that player you just can't pass on at a position you didn't expect to be drafting shows up? What if Will Johnson turns out to be there? The cornerback from Michigan, who is 7th on the big board right now, the consensus board. And all of a sudden you're pivoting today, or maybe they love Jahdae Barron, the cornerback from Texas, who I think probably is a nickel for the Packers, but maybe you let him try it outside first. And you can grab a corner at 23. Does that change? Because now, like, it's one thing to not get your pass rusher, but get your receiver. I think receiver and pass rusher are bigger on the need levels than your corner. But there might be a player who's just too good to pass up in a situation like that. So then this complicates what you're going to do at 54. Do you want to grab a receiver and hope that you can get one of these 3rd round pass rushers? There are some guys there. Kyle Kennard from South Carolina. You could hope that Femi Oladejo is there from UCLA. You could hope that Braden Swinson is there from LSU. He's creeping up the boards. He's now at 73. I like him higher than that. I like him in the 2nd round. This is tough because you have the opportunity to draft a really good player, but it kind of convolutes your draft. The receiver options at 87, it's like Alec Ayumanor, Isaiah Bond, who just turned himself in for sexual assault. That's obviously not great. You just can't feel good about getting one of these impact players. You're having to do that at the cost of another position where you think you have a need. I think you have to stick with the receiver piece of this. If you're going to take the corner, what you're saying is, we're going to let our coverage help our pass rush. We're going to trust Jeff Hafley to manufacture the pass rush. You take that corner and then you get a receiver in the second. And then whatever happens in the third happens in the third. I think you can still look at offensive line. You're just probably not going to get quite as crazy. You're not going to have the opportunities to get quite as crazy, and that's okay. There is such a nice little cluster in the second round of positions and players that they could be looking at. It's why I would just be kind of a little bummed. I mean, I love Will Johnson. Look, I love Will Johnson. I think he's like a top 10 kind of talent. If he fell, he'd be awesome. You need those sort of field tilting players. But that's probably going to come at the expense of a bigger need. So that's going to be something you have to balance. And it's not an easy balance to find. Okay. What about offensive line? What about it? We'll talk about it next on Locked On Packers. Thanks for making Locked On Packers your first listen. Now for your second listen, check out Locked On NFL Draft with Damian Parson and Keith Sanchez. Now that the season is over, get the latest draft rankings, rumors, and news every day. Find Locked On NFL Draft on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts, and find Keith Sanchez on this show next week. We've talked about offensive line in the first, and this would be similar to the Will Johnson example where someone like Kelvin Banks, and I do think it would have to be someone like Kelvin Banks, is there at 23. I think Kelvin Banks is one of the 10 best players in this draft. Maybe he's a guard for the Packers. Okay, fine. I would let him compete at tackle. You've got Jordan Morgan, though. Maybe, but that at least that gives you a lot of different flexibility and options in the way that you're going to put this offensive line together. You just can't pass up, to me, someone who I think is an elite talent. So if I'm in that draft room, I'm going, we can't pass on Kelvin Banks unless you also have Teteroa McMillan or Mykel Williams staring at you there, who I also think are top 10 sorts of talents. Unless those guys are there, I want to take Kelvin Banks. Well, this presents that same sort of scenario where you're going, okay, well, where do I find the pass rush then? Do I have to hope Landon Jackson makes it there? Do I have to hope that someone like Tyleik Williams is available to me at 54? And even then, Tyleik Williams has the upside to be a pass rusher. He's a very good run defender, but not a pass rusher right now. Do you just go full steam ahead and in the trenches, TJ Sanders? You're not going to find a player, I think, on the interior or frankly on the edge who can impact your team the way that a receiver for this team could. A Jaden Higgins, a Jack Besh, a Trey Harris. Now, I'm a little lower on Trey Harris, so for me, it's Higgins clearly at the top. Besh is that pure second round receiver for the Packers. There's so much Puka Nacua in there. There's so much late career Jordy Nelson in there. I think he's a tailor-made Matt LaFleur receiver, is going to block his ass off, going to run. He's a running back after the catch. Can get open. I think he can play wide. I think he can play in the slot. That would be how I would frame this. But then again, you're hoping like maybe Jordan Birch from Oregon falls. Or maybe you're hoping maybe they really like Kyle Kennard from South Carolina. Those round 3 edges, it really starts to fall off. So do you reach in round 2 for a Braden Swinson? I don't think it would be really much of a reach. I'm 54 would be fine with me for him. I think he's a really good player. All the underlying metrics say he's a killer pass rusher. He's big enough. We don't have the full testing on him, but I mean, I'm not really, frankly, worried about it. This is the same problem. It gets complicated. So I'm not going to say that the Packers can't do this. But when it comes to finding value, these are the kinds of conversations that I want the front office to be having. Hey, let's say there's a player that we love that's available. Okay, but what is the opportunity cost? What does that mean? There are positions that aren't being addressed, and can we justify, especially at offensive line? I don't think you can justify it at offensive line the same way you could at corner. Now, I'm not saying you can't justify it at all, but you can't justify it the same way. You get a high-end number one corner. That is something the Packers don't currently have. You draft a tackle like Kelvin Banks and you get a high-end guard or tackle, you already have one of each of those. And you don't have any holes in that group. It's a thin corner group. Like, you can make that case at corner if one of those guys you love, a Jahdae Barron, a Will Johnson, is there, that it makes sense. I would probably want to trade out if it's an offensive lineman. Now, defensive tackle, I think you can end up having it look if they want to go. And I say this for the end because, remember, for a long time, I think they're going to draft Derek Harmon. 27th right now on the consensus board. And I use the consensus board not because the Packers use the consensus board, but I want to be fair to the audience to say this is where the general consensus has these players. So I want to make sure that I'm putting these guys in buckets that seem reasonable and fair. Using the consensus is I think a good way to do that. It's not always hyper accurate. Todd McShay's 100 big board has been better than the consensus board over the last few years. He's really plugged in. Dane Brugler, I trust that. Top 100, same kind of deal. I trust that it reflects what the NFL believes. But this is just an easy way to make it fair. So that's why I use it. But let's say Walter Nolan, Derek Harmon at 23. I think you can follow the same basic model. I don't know that there is a world where the Packers double up at defensive line, even if some people might want that. If they're taking an edge, I think it's because they feel like they have a plan at defensive tackle with Devontae Wyatt, with Kenny Clark under contract, with Carl Brooks one more year on that deal after this one. They have a little bit more flexibility there. The conversation we had yesterday was more about the value in this draft, maybe on day 2, especially with that second round pick, just being better at tackle when it comes to the 54th overall pick. If you take Derek Harmon, you say, this is the pass rusher we are adding. That's the conversation you're having if you're Green Bay. And then you're going, okay, what's the situation after that? So I think it looks a lot the same, where you're getting a receiver in round 2 if you can. There's not really an offensive lineman to get there. That's the interesting thing. Ariante Irsay from Minnesota is really the only guy in that range who plays tackle. He's big for the Packers. I'd be surprised if he were their kind of player. Marcus Mo from Purdue, he's too far down. That'd be a reach for me. I think I have him about a round later than the consensus board too. If they took Ozzie Trapillo, I wouldn't blink. I think he's a really good player. I would take him at 54 all day if that's the way they wanted to go. But then you miss out on your receiver. So I think you have to go receiver in round 2 if you're not going to go receiver in round 1, or you're not going to trade down and take him at the top of the second, whatever it is. You've got to get a receiver with the top 2 picks. You don't have to, but I think that's the Packers' plan. And so I think it is reflective here. The reason we do these and we do them over the course of, multiple weeks is statuses change. Look, Isaiah Bond, just had a legal issue. He is not going to go in the top 100, I don't think. 2 weeks before the draft, you get picked up for sexual assault, or you turn yourself in for sexual assault, regardless of when it happened. I mean, he might not get drafted. He was already an undersized player. There was already questions about, his makeup. This is not going to help that. So you got to get that receiver early. I don't know that that's changed too much, but there was a chance Jalen Royals was going to be there at 87. There's still a chance, but I think it's less likely. So doing these exercises is more about, trying to find those sweet spots. and trying to game it out. I hope the Packers are doing that. I know that there are some teams that look at them and go through these exercises and go, hey, okay, if they take this player who's, and try to figure out who are the likely players going to be for them. You can't do it much past the first round, I don't think. But I think looking at your board and going, okay, there's these group of players. It's why we're starting to see, I think, these trends on, okay, so it's mid-round offensive linemen, like, rounds 3, round 4, round 5. It's first-round pass rushers. It's first-round receivers. It's day 2 defensive tackles. We're starting to get a picture of what this is looking like, and I think that was why I wanted to do this here. Next week, a ton of interviews coming. Keith Sanchez from the Draft Network and Locked On NFL Draft, who I mentioned. Mike Renner from CBS Sports is going to be on here. Ross Uglum from Packer Report is going to be on here. Trevor Sikkema from Pro Football Focus is going to be on here. So we're going to have a blast next week. I hope you will join me. Follow me on all the social medias. Follow the podcast on all the social media. Subscribe to the podcast wherever you do podcasts. Subscribe over on our YouTube page. We'll be live after the draft so you can stay locked on Packers.